We want to work on section 14.2 and translate and reflect some of these sine and cosine graphs. As we do so, there are certain steps that are in here. Of course, we have with our sine, we have the amplitude. That's the A in front. The B right here tells us about the period. For the sine and cosine, it's 2 pi divided by that B. This H represents the phase shift or the horizontal translation, and the K on the outside represents the vertical translation. Also gives us the equation of the midline. Okay, what we want to do is identify those things and also an x increment and divide that, which is dividing the period by 4. Let's start with one of these guys. Okay, on this graph we can see that our amplitude is 2. Our vertical translation is going to be 3, and that's going to be up here. Our midline then would be y is equal to 3, and our period would be 2 pi divided by that number in front of the x, which would be 4. So it looks like this is just going to be pi halves. There's no phase shift in this one. And our x increment is going to be 2 pi, let's try that again. Not 2 pi. Rather, it's going to be pi halves divided by 4, which is just pi eighths. Okay, let's put this together. First off, we want our midline. So we'll draw that in here. Up 1, 2, 3. And here's our midline going through here. A nice dash line gives us some reference. So that represents our vertical translation. Now our amplitude, what I do is I take that 3 and which comes from my vertical translation, and I add the 2 from the amplitude, and then I subtract the 2. And what that does is give me my maximum and minimum. So I know that that's going to go up 2, and then it's going to go down 2. If I take a look at my increment, let's draw our 4 points or 4 increments along here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of those increments is going to be pi eighths. So this one would be pi eighths. This would be 2 pi eighths or pi fours. This one would be 3 pi eighths. And this one would be 2 pi fourths or pi halves, which would complete the period. So what I want to do is start here at the axis because I didn't have any phase shift. And from there with my sine curve, I want to go up 2, back to my midline, down 2, and back to my midline as I hit those 4 points. And now I just sketch the curve. Here we go up, we go down, and back. Now you can kind of continue this on if you wanted in both directions, but I do want to see the increments on the x-axis, and also I want to see what happens with our translation and vertical increments. So that would graph that one. Let's try another one. Here I can see my amplitude is 5. There is no vertical translation. My midline is going to be y is equal to 0 because there isn't any translation. My period is 2 pi divided by 2, which would be just pi. My phase shift is going to be 3 pi to the right, but actually if I go one cycle here of 2 pi, I'm actually going to end up at pi, right? If I just subtract that, I end up with pi. And then my increment would be my pi divided by 4. Okay, so now I take my amplitude, I have to go up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have to do my x increment, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4. The x increment is going to be pi fourths, so this would be pi fourths. This would be 2 pi fourths or pi halves. This would be 3 pi fourths. And this one would be 4 pi fourths or pi, which is our period. Okay, as I mark this then, Since this is a cosine curve, I want to start up at the top here at 5, then hit my midline here at pi fourths, then go down to pi halves at -5, back to my midline, and then back up here at 5. So this curve will look kind of like this. And again, you can make some on the other side. Remember to show me the vertical increments here and also what's happening with the period. Okay. One more here. This is a little easier. Go ahead and pause if you would. Try and identify these things for the amplitude, the vertical translation, midline period, phase shift, and x increment. Okay, the amplitude I can see here is just 1. There's nothing out in front of the cosine. Vertical translation is it's going to go up 4. Our midline then, of course, is y is equal to 4. The period is just 2 pi. The phase shift, there isn't any. And the x increment is going to be my period, 2 pi divided by 4, which is just pi halves. Okay, if I graph this one, I got to take my midline up. So I have to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. Oops. I want that dashed. Okay, there we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, so that went up 4. And then what I do is I take the 4 and I want to add 1, and then 4 subtract 1, and that's going to tell me how high and low this is going to be. So I got to go up to 5 and then down to 3 to make that work. Putting in my increments in here, since there's no phase shift, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, and each increment is going to be pi halves. So this is pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, and 2 pi, which complete the period. Since this is a cosine, I want to start here on my above my midline here at 5. Then I want to hit the midline. I want to go below the midline, back to the midline, and then back up here at 5. So this curve would look something kind of like this. And again, you can extend it out if you want to do that. Make sure that you put in the high and the low so that I can see that along with the increments on the x-axis. Okay, hopefully you're getting a hold of this, but let's do a few more. Our amplitude here is 3. Vertical translation, there isn't any. The midline would be y equals 0 because there's no translation. The period is 2 pi because there isn't anything out in front of the x. The phase shift looks like we go pi halves to the right. And the x increment is going to be pi halves divided by 4, which is, 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi halves. All right, since we've got our midline at 0, we need to go up 3. 1, 2, 3. Now let me make those just a little bit bigger. 1, 2, 3, and down 1, 2, 3. I got my increments here. Let's see. But I've got a phase shift, so of pi halves, so I'm going to make probably 5 of these to make sure I can get there. So my x increment is going to be pi halves, but it's been translated pi halves to the right. So this is going to be my pi halves right here, and then pi, 3 pi halves, 4 pi halves, which is 2 pi, and then 5 pi halves sitting out here, which would complete the period. Okay, so if I graph this, starting with my sine, I'm going to start right here at pi halves because it's been translated there. I want to go up to 3 at pi, back to my midline, down to 2 pi, and then back to 5 pi halves. So if I get this picture, it kind of looks like this. And again, you could probably fill in right there. This goes up to 3 and down to -3, and that would be the sine. Okay, just a couple more. Go ahead and pause and see if you can pick out the amplitude, the vertical translation, midline, period, phase shift, and x increment. Okay, in this one, the amplitude is 1. The vertical translation is 1 going down. The midline is going to be y is equal to -1. The period is 2 pi, because there isn't anything in front of the x. But the phase shift is going to be pi, going back 1, going to the left. And then the x increment is going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi halves. Okay, so I'll start by making my midline here at -1. Give me a nice straight line. There we go. Something like that. Okay, the phase shift is pi to the left. All right, but the increment is pi halves. So if I go pi to the left, there's my first one. Let's get that just a little bit further out there. Okay, so here's my pi. There's my pi halves. There's another pi halves, 3, 4. So I'm kind of out here. Okay, so this be negative pi. This be negative pi halves. Of course, that's 0. This would be pi halves and pi sitting out here. That would complete my periods this way. My amplitude is 1, so I have to go up. Let's see. Let's go -1. I have to add 1 and -1 and subtract 1. So I have to go between 0 and -2. So I don't want that. But I do want 0 and here to be my -2. Okay. So since this is a sine curve, I'm going to start right here at negative pi. Oops, sorry, I don't want to do that. I want to start right here on my midline. I want to go up at pi halves, hit my midline, down at pi halves, and then back up at pi. So this one would kind of look like this. Let me draw that. Goes from 0 down to -2. Of course, you can check these guys on your calculator when you do these, and that would be acceptable to do that. But just make sure that you give me the increments and kind of a minimum of where these coordinates are. All right. Let's get this one. This is a kind of a real mess. Here I can see my amplitude is 2, but it's inverted, right? Because it's got that negative. Vertical translation, there isn't any. Midline is going to be y is equal to 0. My period is going to be 2 pi divided by that 2/3, which is out in front, which is going to be 3 pi. My phase shift is going to be pi halves to the right. And my increment is going to be 3 pi divided by 4. That's my x increment. Okay, so let's start this over here to pi halves to the right. There's our 1, 2, let's see. I got to add 3 pi halves to that, right? So I don't want to be here. So if I go pi halves, oops, I did that wrong again. Pi halves to the right. Let's do it here. Okay, so there's pi halves. 2, 3, 4. Let's get it out here. All right. So if I translate that out here, here is my pi halves. I need to increment that by 3 pi halves, or 3 pi fourths rather. So that would be 5 pi fourths. And then adding another 3 pi fourths would give me 8 pi fourths, which would be 2 pi. And then an 11 pi fourths. Somewhere out there. Okay, my midline is 0. I have to go up 2, down 2, and it's inverted, right? So the sine will start down. So if I graph this, here I'm going to start at pi halves. we're going to go down 2, back to my midline, up 2, and then back to my midline out here, which will complete the period. Okay, let's go down, back up, 2, and then back down here. Okay, so it looks kind of like that. Again, I can see I'm up here at 2 and down at -2, and then that would complete my period out there, which would be, what is that, 6, well, it's out there a ways. Okay, here's a cosine that's inverted as well. I'll leave this one to you to go ahead and figure out. You can see the amplitude here is 1. Vertical translation, there's none. The midline would be y equals 0. The period is 2 pi. The phase shift is pi halves going to the left. And the x increment would be 2 pi divided by 4, which is just pi halves. Okay, we'll let you work on this one. Hopefully this has been enough to get you going.